Welcome to Maps and Meta-Analysis.
Looking at California cities. Hi, I'm Darvesh
And I'm Justin Hurst, and this is Facts and Folsom,
a meta-analysis. Hello everyone, this is episode 8 of Maps and Meta-Analysis. Obviously the season name is Facts and Folsom. We were gone last week because Justin is a busy parent,
and I'm working on my thesis, which I need to have done in a month, so that takes priority right now.
So hence the reason, but we had a city council meeting this week, and it was a very good city council meeting, actually very analogous to the last city council meeting in some ways, but very much the opposite in other regards, so we're going to dive into a lot of that during this meeting. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we get started?
I think those differences, that'll definitely be the meat of what we talk about in the agenda. There were a couple of presentations like usual, but really I think the appeal of another project and the differences therein, both in terms of the audience and the project specifics, will be very interesting for analysis.
Yeah. So just without further ado, we'll get into it. I'll go through some of the unscheduled presentations. So these happen at the very beginning of the city council meeting. This is just kind of ordinary citizens, so not any sort of like commission or department that's presenting anything. They have like a 3-minute time limit, so pretty terse, all things considered. There was someone by the name of I want to say Steve Dick. Apologies if I get some of the names wrong. If you hear like one of your names or like you think it's you that I'm talking about, feel free to reach out and we'll correct the record. But I was just taking these notes as the meeting was going on, and this was the kind of like best pronunciation or notation that I could get at the time. So he had kind of an interesting comment about the East Bidwell corridor. So he was specifically talking about the kind of delineation between the newest development of Folsom and the rest of Folsom. So there's a big highway, like Highway 50, which goes all the way to Lake Tahoe and then all the way west to San Francisco. And basically on the south side of that, going north to south, there's a road called East Bidwell. And he basically made a couple of comments that, as the development was going on, that corridor was not really sufficient to handle the kind of traffic that was flowing through it. He also just claimed that, there's some like kind of poor design choices in terms of, where certain turn lanes are, just like the wideness of the road, like how the off-ramp, on-ramp comes in. So that was kind of interesting in its own right, and kind of gave, I don't know, it was good to see people talk about transit in general. Like, it does seem like this is a maybe more subtle but recurring issue. And then the other presentation was Caitlin Conway. And so she was another high school student who presented about the SB 54 bill. And I believe SMUD, I guess, has like a program for high school students to like participate in their local city government and talk about this bill. And it basically aims to eliminate plastic bags or like single-use plastics from like grocery stores and things like that in favor of more recyclable materials like paper or things like canvas, like those canvas bags, for example.
I believe this is something that we've heard of before, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So there was another high school student. I actually don't know if it was the last meeting or the meeting prior to that. But it's actually really cool to see young people involved in this. Even if it's just for maybe like school credit or something, or maybe just to get extra credit. It's still important nonetheless. We never discussed like how we're gonna jump back and forth. I don't know. Do you want to do some of the scheduled presentations and then go back and forth? Or?
Just however you want to do it.
Okay.
I was only there, unfortunately, for the first part of the meeting. There was some significant discussion at the end, but I couldn't stay very late this time.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I remember. Okay, so I'll try to go through as much as possible, and we'll try to get into the meat and potatoes of the meeting in a bit. So there was a proclamation by the mayor of the city celebrating the National Public Safety Telecommunications Week in the city of Folsom. And basically these would be people like dispatchers and like communication managers at, basically like wherever your 911 call would be routed. Like these are the people picking up the phone immediately, and they had some like pretty incredible stats. It was like, like 90+% of calls picked up within like, like 15 seconds or like something like, some like really extraordinary responsiveness.
Did they say how many staff they have?
No, I think it was just a subset of the staff that were being recognized. I'm not sure exactly how many it was, but it was met with like a really substantial applause. So clearly this is something that's like really important to the members of Folsom, like, or at least the I don't know how well you could extrapolate it to all the residents, but at least those that were there, seem to be overwhelmingly in support of this.
I would say, generally speaking, Folsom is very in support of anything safety related, whether that be the police department, the fire department. Dispatchers seems like that would fall into that category.
Yeah, exactly. There was also a proclamation by the mayor encouraging the community to become involved in Arbor Day, and we got to see the city arborist, which is kind of nice. This is becoming a regular theme, and I mean, she has some great points, like basically, take care of the environment around you, like support the trees around you if you can, and if you have the ability, try to plant a tree, try to like take care of a tree if you can, because they form a really integral part of Sacramento. And I know it's especially nice here because it gets like really hot in the summers, and so like every bit of shade is like an enormous relief. Like no kidding, it's like maybe 20 degrees different, like under a tree versus just in the sun. So yeah, it was kind of nice to see. There's also a pretty lengthy presentation from the I guess Chamber of Commerce and the Tourism Bureau about the historic depot building. So
there was an assessor that was coming in and talking about the renovation for these buildings.
Oh, right.
The historic depot building is currently being used by the Chamber of Commerce and the Tourism Bureau as like their main office building. I believe they're also opening it up to other members of the public as well. And then there's also a separate building several streets over for an old superintendent building that is currently, I don't believe, being used, and that is in significantly worse shape. You could tell, one, from the discussion, but two, also just based on the pictures that they showed. And it seemed like, based on the discussion, there was more of a willingness to like do any necessary renovations and upkeep on that depot building that is being used by the city Chamber of Commerce versus the superintendent building. There was definitely some skepticism on whether or not it's worth it. Some numbers for you on the projected cost of rehab for the depot building would be about $107,000 just for the rehab costs, not including anything such as budgeting for starting the work, inspections that may need to be done, permitting, anything like that. And then the superintendent rehab would be something about $623,000 just for the rehab costs. So these are, considering that we're already projecting a deficit and there's all these other budget constraints for the city, these are big costs for the city to be asked to deal with. And while there may be a willingness, at least for some of the rehabilitation, I think that there was some right discussion from the city council on where the city's priorities are, and it's a balance between preserving history and allocating finances in a way that is functional to serve the interests of the people who are currently living here.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of discussion on like ROI basically. So I think the way that the city and a lot of residents often justify these kind of expenditures is that the historic district is really important. It's typically a big economic driver for both the residents of Folsom and then tourists who come in. So I think the kind of calculus is something like, well, if we restore it, then that makes the entire neighborhood more lively, and it ultimately increases the kind of total revenue that area generates, and that ultimately percolates through property taxes as well, but mainly like sales tax and things that kind of offset the cost over the lifespan of the building basically. But yeah, it's a bit of a tenuous argument because it's hard to measure exactly what that kind of ROI would be. It's these are such like intangible things, like what contributes to the overall vibe. And also from what the assessor said, it didn't seem like these were changes that needed to be made in such a way that like the building would just collapse in a very short amount of time. They seemed like, okay, if we want to properly restore this type of building, like these are the steps that would need to be made. And I didn't really sense any kind of like direness in the tone. But I don't know. What did you think?
Well, I've had a personal experience with a historic depot building because that's where my first job was. I worked for the Chamber of Commerce, I've been in those offices frequently. One of the other concerns that was raised that I think is very important is Part of these rehab costs, in addition to preserving the history of these buildings, is bringing them up to code because they're not currently up to code. And one of those being ADA compliance.
Right.
And as it stands right now, the buildings aren't very accessible for anyone that may have a wheelchair or disability.
Right.
And I think that's an important consideration as well, if these are going to be open to the public, that they are in compliance with ADA.
Yeah, that's a great point, yeah. Because ultimately that's like something that, yeah, if you want to preserve something historical, you want it to be accessible by like everyone involved. So, yeah, it's a great point. Was that it for that? Or
Yeah, we can move on to the next one. The next report was from the Folsom Tourism Bureau on just a financial update from, was 2021-22 the right year? I feel like it was more recent than that.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Because I think they, I think they like finished collating all the data and things.
So this is where we're going to get into a little bit more of the Zydeco system that we've been talking about in previous episodes.
Yeah, it's come up in like a couple of meetings, but we actually got to see some of the figures and you know, like data that's collected and generated by Zydeco, and it was pretty interesting, I have to say. So yeah.
Yeah, some of the insights we got from Zydeco details include that the Bay Area is the largest single region that people are coming to Folsom from to spend money and just visit. So, for example, it contributes over 25% of what is totally spent by people coming into the city that aren't residents, with the next biggest region being LA, which was somewhat smaller of a percentage, but still notable. And person per person, the Bay Area spends more money than the LA visitors do. And I think that based on the commentary with this presentation too, that income and the per capita expenditures is something that the city wants to capitalize on and like really attract these Bay Area residents because they're helping our local economy. Some other information is that food is the biggest category of spending. About 30% of the revenue coming from out of town is for food categories, with hotels for people that are staying. The occupancy rate is somewhere around 71%, which is, well, I thought frankly pretty high, especially because it was mentioned that if you have hotel occupancy on average being above, was it 70%, usually means you want to build a new hotel, which currently is already happening.
Yeah.
In the Palladio complex, they are building a new hotel.
Yeah, which I like. That was such a fascinating detail that they just kind of dropped in the middle of the presentation. That I was like, wait, what? Like, what happened there? Because I would have thought like a project as big as that would merit, you know, much more discussion and kind of oversight. But maybe it's one of those things where those discussions happen in like at the planning commission level, you know, long ago, and it's sort of it won't really like get to the point of public comment until much later, or you know, it had its kind of moment of public comment much earlier. So yeah, that was a pretty interesting detail. Also for the hotel occupancy, they mentioned how I think post-COVID, a lot of the occupancy rates flipped throughout the week. So typically, I think like there are certain weekdays which had the highest occupancy due to like business conferences and you know, just people coming.
I think it was earlier in the week it used.
Yeah, earlier in the week. It was like, you know, like Monday. You know, Monday the occupancy rate was like like the upper 50s, lower 60s, something like that. And then, you know, toward the weekend it was like over 80% or something. So so it averages out to 70, but that doesn't mean it's like even throughout the week. So yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. And I guess post-COVID, the weekend is, you know, the higher occupancy when previously that wasn't the case. So yeah, I don't know. I just thought that was kind of fascinating.
Yeah, the only other thing that was discussed in this part of the presentation was how there was an emphasis on perhaps integrating more with the wine regions that are surrounding Folsom, including the foothills. One idea that was discussed was a foothill wine pass that could be offered with a booking of a hotel to incentivize people to stay in and around the region.
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't think it's an idea. I think this is like actually something you can get.
Yeah, but I think they were talking about advertising more and like partnering with bookings for the hotels.
Oh, I see. And then I guess was the difference that they wanted like a different tiers of passes and things, whereas currently there was only like one level of pass that was offered when you book a hotel?
I'm not sure whether or not this was a proposal or already in effect, but yes, there were different tiers. One being basically like, oh, just as like here's a 1 or 2 day pass for this price, whereas another one was something like 2 months for another price of just being able to go to different wineries, which I'm not sure how, like, what the metrics would be on what people would buy out of that. I think that would be interesting data to come to.
Yeah. I think it'd be cool to have, like, I think I mentioned this in there, but like, it'd be cool to have like some sort of like shuttle service
Mm-hmm.
to where you can go on a tour of like multiple wineries instead of like, I don't know, just driving from like one to the other. I mean, obviously there's like an immediate safety concern, and like
Yeah.
you're going there to drink at these places. And so, I mean, some people might be fortunate and you have multiple designated drivers, and you're all sort of like rotating out, or someone just doesn't drink. But I think it would make it much more accessible if you had like an itinerary of, like three. You could pick like any of, three wineries on the way or something,
Yeah.
and it would just, it would leave you there for like an hour or something, and you could just try it out, and it's like a few minutes to each one.
Okay, that was most of the conversation on that presentation. So we can go ahead and move ahead. The consent calendar, pretty quick. I believe there were a couple of items that were pulled off of the consent calendar. Do you recall what those were?
The only notable one for me was council member YK Chalmchirla, who kind of just celebrated the fire department for like saving a bit of money. So I guess their allocation was like $11.8 million, or there was an estimate of $11.8 million to build like was it a fire station? I presume it was a fire station.
Yes, I think it was a fire station.
Which, I mean, I guess that fact alone I thought was kind of interesting, because a couple of city council meetings ago they mentioned how they were like behind on overtime payments or something for the fire department. So I'm sort of curious like how this plays into that calculus. I mean, obviously there could just be a law that states, once you have like this amount of land area with like residential space.
I would think it would be separate, because this is more of a capital cost, whereas overtime is more of a labor cost.
Yeah, I know, but just because like the fire department makes up like 25% of the budget, so you would think that like, okay, if there's some pressure there, that there's not like much room to, or like I feel like something like this could be postponed. Although then again, I mean, the Folsom Ranch area is like developing quite rapidly, and so yeah, it might just be like a legal necessity to build a fire station. So, but anyway, there was an estimate of 11.8 million, and I guess they got a vendor proposal for 10.4 million. So there's
the savings.
Yeah, of 1.5 million, and I think YK just wanted to celebrate that. But that was the only thing that was pulled out. I don't remember.
Yeah, everything else was uncontroversial, very much same as previous weeks. Different approval of minute agendas, as well as some giving the city manager power to execute agreements.
Yeah, so basically like contracts and things for, there's like water, sewage, that kind of stuff. So do you want to move on to the...
Yeah, we're going to move on to new business.
Yeah. Actually, I totally forgot about this. So it's called... So the actual number is 11012, a resolution to duly name the existing green room within the historic depot building at 200 Wall Street the Peter T. Lewis Green Room, and recognition of donation of funds for interior improvements by the Lewis family. So I guess there's a guy named Peter Lewis. He donated $25,000 to the FHDA. I actually don't know. I wish I'd spelled that out.
Folsom Historic District
Association?
I think so. Don't quote us on that.
Yeah. But I guess they're like a sub-leasee.
Yeah, of the Chamber of Commerce. For that building.
Yeah.
And basically, I believe he had a son who passed, who he wanted to name this room in honor of him, and provided a donation. And so the city council voted to dual name the room with the Peter T. Lewis as the Peter T. Lewis Green Room, as well as the existing name, which I don't know if it was the Green Room. I think there was another name.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that actually. I just assumed it was like a green room, like in general.
Yeah. No, I think there was another name that was attached to it, but it wasn't necessarily reflected in the agenda.
Yeah. So I don't know. I thought that was cool. Like that people are philanthropic enough to like donate to Folsom. I also wonder for like larger, more historic cities, like how that factors in.
Yeah, I mean, I would think larger cities probably would need a higher donation threshold.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, to get recognized?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, actually. I didn't even think about that. I just meant like, yeah, there might be like more donations flowing in, and so... But I guess, yeah, maybe that's a corollary to that, is like, if there's so many donations, if it's so trivial, then you might be like... Anyway. Cool. So now we'll move on to the main topic, which took up the vast majority of the actual meeting.
Before we dive into it, I
Mhm.
just want to give a little perspective. So
Sure.
I was maybe 5 minutes late to the city council meeting, but it took me maybe half an hour to get to my seat, just because there were so many people who were piling like in the back, out the door, overfilling the seats. And it was, I would say, the most heavily attended city council meeting that I've been to, even more so than the last one. And you could definitely tell why people were there because they were very well organized.
Mhm.
In the back, they had a distribution system for shirts that basically proclaimed support for the not the applicant,
The applicant.
applicant.
Yeah.
Yes, the applicant in support of basically denying the appeal. And I think that was an important notable difference, especially as someone who was just coming in to like understand what the meeting was about. It was like you got an immediate sense of where at least that portion of the community was at.
Yeah, it was like very animated. Like there's a different energy in the room for sure. A lot of like crowd jeering and booing and stuff, which was kind of. I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of fun to see, even though it's not like part of the decorum, right, of those types of situations.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. So I'll read the actual title of this agenda item, and then we can kind of break it down like we did last time. So it's called Appeal by Bob Delp of Decisions by the Historic District Commission approving a conditional use permit and design review for the Uncle Charlie's Firehouse and Brew Project, PN 22-158, located at 905 Leidesdorf?
I think it's
Leidesdorf Street, and determination that the project is exempt from CEQA. Okay, so let's break that down. So the Historic District, so this is a business that wants to open in a currently vacant building in the Historic District. Hence,
the key difference there being it is a currently existing building as opposed to last week, which was a whole new project where there'd be new construction.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so because it's in the Historic District, it has to go through the Historic District Commission, probably in addition to the Planning Commission, I would imagine. Yeah. But I guess the Historic District gets some like extra oversight over these types of things. And basically that what they determined was that because there's no change to the structure of the building, meaning like you're not actually building a new structure for a business. You're simply like filling an empty storefront with a new
modifications.
With some internal modifications, but not to the actual like walls and support structures of the building, for example. And so what they determined is that because of that they were exempt from CEQA, which is I believe so it's CEQA, which stands for California Environmental Quality Act.
Yep,
okay.
That's right.
And the idea here being that okay, if you have a new construction, then you need to assess the impacts on the environment. However, if you're just moving into an existing building, the idea is that disruption is negligible, and so you can be exempt from that sort of those sorts of checks. And so the appellant Bob Delp, his argument was that this should not be exempt from CEQA, and well, I guess his argument was that it could have some impact on the local area, in terms of parking, in terms of odor, in terms of just foot traffic in general. And so he argues that even though it could be benign, and he seemed of the opinion that it was more likely than not that it was going to come up kind of empty-handed in terms of no like strict action or anything. But his argument was more out of principle and out of process that we shouldn't just exempt businesses from these types of things. So yeah, that was kind of his fundamental argument.
Yeah, so the key difference I'll just pull out there being, as opposed to the last week's objection, basically it was more of a process argument rather than specific to the process. Rather than specific to the project itself. And he definitely gave a sense that he was somewhat in support of the project. But I think there's a little bit more nuance in this argument in that like it's more of a discussion on the way in which projects are approved.
Yeah. And I don't know, I felt kind of conflicted because I think on principle I did agree with some of his points. However, I think the city council members who were kind of rebutting Mr. Delp were basically saying that that the law is the law, right? This exemption is clearly stated. It is kind of unambiguously followed by the applicant who was trying to open the brewery. They even they even mentioned this like very specific change, for example, where I guess there was the historic district had some concerns about odor from the brewing process, and so they actually required the business to get this like $5,000 condenser for the for like the brewing process, and it was actually really fascinating because some of the people who were testifying, which we'll get to in a minute, they actually owned breweries themselves, and so they were highly familiar with all the technical concepts, and so they kind of put it into perspective that despite them having owned a brewery for many years, they had never seen anyone use like this strict of a method to supposedly stop odors. So even they felt like it was pretty onerous relative to all of the things that they've seen.
Before we jump into the discussion, I just, for anyone out there who's very legally minded and may want to look this up, I want to mention the CEQA exemption codes. So the two codes that were identified as exempting of this project from CEQA is 15301 and then 15303. 15301 under CEQA being for existing facilities, there's no need for a CEQA assessment. For 15303 being for smaller structures, which this qualifies as because it's a smaller building attached to a parking garage.
Yeah. Cool. And then they mentioned in the presentation some of the meeting notes from the Historic District Commission. So one I already mentioned, the odor impacts. The other ones were architecture and design. So because it's in the historic district, you want to kind of preserve as much of the aesthetic of the neighborhood as possible, even maybe to a larger extent than like a typical district. Maybe not typical, but like just of the other districts.
I think it'd be fair to say that.
Yeah. Okay. I just didn't want to mean like, oh, there's like a mediocre district and then there's like a historic district.
Oh no, I don't think anyone got that.
Okay. The other notes were so architecture and design. In particular, they mentioned like the bifold glass doors. That maybe it's like a bit too modern for something that should look kind of historic, and I guess the idea was that maybe you want wood doors or something, or something as close to the original wood doors. Was that more or less the?
That was the sense I got.
Okay, yeah. It was never stated that clearly, so I don't know if anyone from that meeting wants to clarify. We'd be happy to take a clarification. There were new ventilation requirements, and then better flexibility for the vent height. Increased days of operation and more brewing days. So basically, they didn't want them to brew as early in the day or as late in the day. So I think the idea was that they allowed them to brew more days of the week to kind of like avoid that issue. And then the appeal from Bob Delp. So here are the reasons that Bob Delp gave for his appeal. This was like the recapitulation by the city of Bob Delp's claims. I was actually a bit confused by this. Do you remember this?
Yeah, let me see.
Yeah. Because basically, I guess let me explain the process. So, someone from the city basically tries to summarize the issue at hand, what the applicant's kind of response and obligations are, and what the appellant, in this case, Mr. Delp, stated.
Yeah, that's
and they try to basically like set the kind of ground for then the applicant to speak, then the appellant to speak, then there's public hearing, then the applicant and the appellant also get time to kind of make some final comments.
Yeah, so I'll just give the big picture reasons from the appellant as well, and then get into a little bit more of the arguments. So the big bucket items were that there were, according to the person presenting these claims, who I believe was the developer, that there were various concerns that they felt were unrelated to the project, so that might be lumped into the process concerns. There was inadequate analysis done for things such as aesthetics, air quality, odor, what we've been talking about. That it also doesn't qualify for those two CEQA exemptions that were mentioned. And that the last piece, being a big discussion item also, was that there was a determination that the parking situation didn't need to be looked at in terms of impact. And that was something that definitely was an item of discussion because the appellant, even though it felt he understood that there may not have been a legal requirement for looking at parking, he still felt that it would be responsible of the city to take a look at what would be the impact on parking, because of that district has already had some issues with parking. That's why there was like a special ad hoc committee just looking at the parking situation in that district. And it's already attached to a parking garage, which sometimes does get crowded, especially on the weekends.
Yeah, and so I think I think I actually don't know what authority CEQA itself has to stop a project, right? So, even if there was like a severe parking impact,
Mhm.
like does, to the best of your knowledge, does CEQA give cities the authority to stop the project for that reason? Or, because I presume that like the city was ultimately the one who had the latitude to decide these types of things, and CEQA was just a framework to assess these various impacts.
Well, so when an assessment has to be done for CEQA,
Mhm.
you're dealing more with the state,
Mhm.
and you need to get those approvals from the state for
Mhm.
you to be able to move forward with the project.
Mhm.
However, functionally, what ends up happening is if there are issues where people who are against a given project use CEQA as justification,
Mhm.
just the threat of litigation
Mhm.
to be able to determine in court whether or not a project needs a CEQA assessment done. Sometimes, like timeline wise and cost wise, is enough to delay or even like eliminate projects from being financially viable. So
Interesting.
that litigation threat is usually the most significant weapon in the arsenal of people who use CEQA against projects.
Interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
So it doesn't even have to do with the sort of like the like litigious merits of the case as
Yeah.
much as it does the because I guess that kind of makes sense. Like these are primarily small businesses, so
Mhm.
the idea that they would be able to, you know, like have some deep understanding of like CEQA law or a hire lawyer who is extremely expert in this when they're just trying to like start a typical business seems like unreasonable.
Well, I will say that the state legislature has been moving in a direction of making it easier to avoid CEQA, especially for housing projects, which this is a business, so it's a little different. But the key thing being threats of litigation are more significant. It seems like for new construction, especially when it comes to something that's a little bit more um, gray in terms of whether or not it actually would qualify for an exemption.
Interesting.
Something like this, based on a plain face reading of the law by people who don't have law degrees, it seems a little bit more black and white in terms of this does qualify for a CEQA exemption. So I'm not entirely sure if that would even be something that would be viable in this case, because I think a judge would see that and possibly throw out a lawsuit.
Yeah. Also, I guess one good point that was brought up by Councilmember Sarah Kina was she really tried to scrutinize like what the law actually says, and I guess it's also not that clear what counts as a change, because I thought that was kind of a good question. It's like, if you're ultimately installing these very like large pieces of equipment in the structure, even though you're not changing, let's say, like the framing of the structure or something like that, it still feels like a pretty substantial change. And is like replacing the floor like considered a change to the structure? Like maybe not to the integrity of the structure, but you're like, if you think of it as like a rectangular prism, like you're changing one of the faces, right? Like what if you replace a window? Does that count? So I think the discretion of what counts as a fundamental change versus like a negligible change does seem like extremely ambiguous and seem very much to rely on the judgment of like council members and the like local business, which I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing, because I feel like also maybe just avoiding these kind of analyses completely is like not actually a real resolution, because I imagine they were instituted for a reason, and it's kind of a shame that maybe it's used as like a litigation tool, but yeah, it feels like we should probably find some middle ground.
Well, it seems like the history of CEQA and everything regarding building in the state of California has been very much a tug of war between developers, businesses on one side, and then people who are more interested in like preserving environmental and like historic aspects of their community on the other side. And it very much seems like it goes back and forth, city to city, project to project, time to time. But right now, it seems like this project is very much not able to be as much of a tug of war as other projects may be. Like I think last week's was a little bit more nuanced in terms of which side perhaps was right in terms of like CEQA process, whereas this one seems a little more one-sided.
It felt pretty cut and dry as far as what the letter of the law said, and again, like I think there were people who were sympathetic to like Bob's arguments. So yeah.
I think one aspect of the argument, which he closed his initial presentation with, was going back to that parking. So the reason that parking wasn't something that had to be considered for this project
Yeah.
was because California law currently states that if you're building within half of a mile of a transit stop, which the light rail station is basically like not even a block away from this location, you don't really need to do a parking analysis because it's considered to be like, oh, it's already accessible to public transit, so people can park far away and get there. The nuance of this being, the appellant acknowledged that that is the law, yes, but that it was irresponsible by the city to not consider that there could be compounding effects, especially if subsequent projects are approved that may increase traffic, because then it will affect, one, the local area in terms of people's ability to go utilize these businesses, but two, also create further problems for the city in the future where they're going to need to like create parking solutions after the fact.
Yeah, I also don't like. I mean, as much as I love the support of like public transit, I do feel like this is maybe the wrong way to think about it. Like, you should be thinking of how many different modes of public transit can get you to that destination, you know, in like a reasonable amount of time. Like, I don't know that it's necessarily the best thing to just put like a radius around a transit stop and be like, well, if anything falls in this radius, then it's kind of exempt. Although I think that does work in some circumstances. Like, I think that kind of rule would work much better in downtown Sacramento, for example, where, you know, there is like a density aspect that's already there, and it would kind of prevent the sparsification, or it would prevent some, you know, otherwise dense area from being used for like parking and things like that. So I in that sense, like that context, I think would be really useful. But, you know, in terms of the light rail, I mean, the light rail pretty much only goes across the, like, what would that be, the western border of Folsom?
Yes, that would be the western border of Folsom. Yeah, so
it and basically the 3 transit stops that are in Folsom are not next to, like, practically any residential areas.
Yeah, it's all business.
Yeah, exactly. It's all business and, like, other retail areas. So it's not like anyone in Folsom could use the light rail to get to this location.
And even if they could, what are the times for the trains?
I think it's every 30 minutes, which is quite a bit.
So if you miss your time by like a couple minutes, you're going to be waiting for 30 minutes.
Yeah, in theory, that should change in a few years. They're adding some like passing tracks, so the frequency should increase to, or the frequency should decrease to every 15 minutes. This was actually a very interesting nuanced point, and I agree with the compounding idea, which is that, you know, just giving an exemption to one thing seems pretty innocuous, but obviously if you give an exemption to like 10 businesses, and then, you know, everyone wants to go to those businesses, which, you know, may be a good thing in the long run, but because you didn't do that planning, you know, maybe now the taxes that you collect from local residents isn't enough to support the kind of like projects that you would need to accommodate these types of things. And you know, had you just had the planning and foresight, you could have maybe started a parking project at the time you gave these approvals, so that by the time, you know, the business was actually in place, that there was like sufficient parking requirements. And again, I don't know. Yeah, like I'm very like pro train and things like that, but ultimately I think the worse that a lot of these laws are written, the more defensive it's going to make people about kind of existing solutions, and it doesn't make it like an enjoyable experience to like switch to transit. I think that's why there's like such an adversarial relationship a lot of times. It's almost seen as like they're taking away my car and they're giving me a worse option to get around. So yeah, anyway, that's my spiel.
So following the appellant was the applicant.
Yes.
And the applicant presentation focused a lot on the explanations for the brewing process, talking about how the condenser, as you mentioned, was the first time that the vendor has ever been asked to like basically produce a condenser. And then they also took the opportunity to ask the city council to make a modification to their conditional use permit as approved by the historical district, changing their start time for brewing earlier by an hour to hopefully mitigate some of the potential concerns about odor, as well as one of the stipulations was that there be no dancing, which the applicant felt that they should be able to dance in their bar.
Yeah, so I guess there was like some archaic like clause or something that kind of got included in the conditional use permit, and they were asking for it to be repealed. I think it actually did get taken out. So
I find it I want to know what the justification for putting that in the beginning was, because that seems overly authoritarian.
I mean, I guess I can kind of see it if you're thinking about like, I don't know why I'm just imagining like a Victorian era type of like justification of like,
But I mean, we're not in the Victorian era.
No, but I mean basically like the remnants of that in sort of like, I don't know, maybe like people in the 1800s were like, oh, you know, we don't want like a classless society that's just like dancing about or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So that was the focus of that presentation, and then I'll offer some general comments on the public comment before handing the rest off to you, since I had to leave at the end of this. The public comment was, once again, very much filled with different speakers. There was over 20 different people that came up to speak. And, you know, initially, having walked in with everyone wearing matching t-shirts, I thought it was going to be pretty one-sided, but there was actually a healthy mix where some other experts came and spoke on to the merits of the appellant and their presentation as well, which I thought was interesting and very nuanced. That being said, the vast majority of the speakers were in favor of the project going forward and therefore against the appeal, with, you know, some of them being pretty substantive bases for why they felt like it was cut and dry, the law said that this should go forward. Whereas I think, especially towards the end, they kind of got off track. It was great that a lot of people heaped praise on the people that were going to be the owners of this establishment, even though that was not necessarily relevant to the case being brought up before the city council. And then things, as you mentioned before, did kind of escalate to a point with some ad hominems. But overall, it was fairly civil, and you got a very clear sense of where the community at large stood.
Yeah. There's something you want to mention about like the notes that were taken in the packet?
Oh, no, that was for the previous meeting.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I'll kind of quickly, I'll maybe just try to highlight some of the speakers. So, actually, no, wait, wasn't it this? They only listed like 9 speakers, and there was like 21 or something.
So the concern that Darvesh is bringing up is when I was going through the packet prepping for this show, it listed the meeting minutes from the previous meeting the city council held, which also had another appeals case against the retired community that was proposed to be built. And I noticed that in the meeting minutes, it listed all the different speakers as only being those that were in opposition to the appeal, which even in that meeting, there were a couple of speakers who were in support of the appeal. So the comment that I wanted to make was I felt like it was a little bit misrepresentative of the actual discussion that was being made, which is why I think Darvesh and I are really trying to take detailed notes speaker by speaker and get a better sense of like, oh, well, here's the nuance of their arguments, and then also trying to cut the more generalist, like, oh, well, here's where the weight was in terms of the public support.
Yeah.
I don't know if that will be the case with this meeting, but if it will, I will probably want to bring it up and address it next time we do.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the clarification. I was, it kind of mixed up the two. Yeah, I guess I feel like I already touched on most of these. One of the notable things was there was a brewery owner from East Sacramento, as well as the owner of a brewery called Red Bus, which I've actually been to. It's a really great place.
Oh, I'm going.
When I interned at ANSYNC, we had like a company outing thing there.
Oh, cool.
We had like a cornhole thing,
and
you got like different like gift cards and stuff. So
nice.
that was pretty cool. Yeah, I would say, I think a lot of it, like Justin already recapitulated, it was a lot of people just like praising the applicant and like her father and stuff, that they were like pillars of the community. I believe he was like a retired firefighter.
Yes.
So it's going to be a very like firehouse kind of themed.
Which I will say, the concept being one of the really cool things about their project is that they bought, I think, the 3rd ever fire engine the city of Folsom had purchased, which was like very old style fire engine, and they're restoring it and converting it into something that they can actually use to serve beer in their establishment. So that's going to be a unique aspect about their business. Yeah,
that was actually super cool. They showed like the old fire engine and stuff like when they bought it and whatnot. So yeah, that was actually pretty cool. I guess I'm trying to go through here. I think Councilmember Kozlowski affectionately mentioned the no dancing clause as the footloose clause.
Oh.
So I think I just ended up annotating it as the footloose clause.
That's hilarious. I want that to be official.
Yeah, I know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think. We already touched on this. The difference between the class 1 versus class 3 exemption. That's like basically, are you making a no change or a negligible change?
Mm-hmm.
And again, the city council itself has a lot of latitude to decide what counts as negligible versus what counts as no change. Yeah, and then the final vote was actually unanimously in yes to reject the appeal. Therefore, the project moves forward. So the motion that actually goes forward is, do we approve the appeal, meaning the appeal made by Bob Dill, or do we reject the appeal, and as a corollary, allow the project to continue forward? And so they all gave these very long sort of like soliloquies on why they thought yes. And I think they also made a point to try to thank a lot of the people who were in the minority in terms of like what their opinion was, which I thought was very good and like indicative of a like healthy civic process. Because even if you're outnumbered like 5-1 or something, you still want to know that the effort that you put in is actually meaningful to the community. Yeah. Because then I think otherwise it'll probably like make people jaded, and they say like, okay, well, if I'm always going to be in the minority, like why do I even come? Like why do I even represent myself? So yeah, that was kind of the end of the issue. Or sorry, it wasn't actually the end of the issue, but that was the end of that item in the agenda. And so I think we wrote a couple of questions towards the beginning, which are like a bit broader. Do you want to run through these? Or?
Let me give a gander. I mentioned there were t-shirts that were handed out in the beginning. They had the hashtag "Don't Stop Beer Reaving," so upon "Don't Stop Believing." I thought that as someone who is a purveyor of dad jokes, I really appreciated that.
Yeah, it was solid. It was like a bright red t-shirt too, so it kind of fit the firefighter theme.
Another observation that I had, very not relevant to the agenda, but just the design of the meeting room. It really feels like there needs to be more space between the different rows, because having to cut through people was one thing, but then having to actually get to where Darvesh was sitting, I had to basically step on people's toes because there's not a lot of room between the seats and the seats in front of you. Especially when you have more packed city council meetings like we've been having lately, I think it's more important to have that space so people can feel comfortable in that space, especially if they're getting up to speak and going back.
Yeah, also there's a lot of older residents in Folsom, and I felt like there wasn't nearly enough like, wheelchair seating or kind of accessible seating for people with canes or like walkers and things like that. So I think that's definitely an area where the city council could improve.
Yeah, and then the last thing was we just noticed an overall tonal difference from this project than compared to the other one, possibly just being due to the fact that this was existing construction that was just being repurposed slightly versus completely new construction as was proposed last time. The opposition was more nuanced rather than just vehemently against, and the people who were more in favor of the project also had, I felt like, more legal concrete justifications for those like reasons why it should go forward.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I actually don't know that I agree that it was necessarily more more nuanced in this case. I feel like maybe the original appeal was more grounded in principle, but I don't know that I would make the case that the argument was any more nuanced.
That's fair.
And also it almost felt like a very philosophical difference, and I really had to like sit there and think, because it kind of broke a lot of my priors and assumptions about what people would do in this type of situation. And I guess my updated conclusion now in my head is I think I think basically stopping a business from continuing forward is kind of seen as like an affront to someone's personal sovereignty, in the same way that adding a new development kind of dilutes someone's personal residential property in a way that's kind of like an affront to their kind of financial personal sovereignty, because a lot of Americans have, a lot of Americans have their wealth tied up in the equity in their homes, and so even a small percentage change there could mean a pretty drastic change in your quality of life, or just your financial well-being in general. And so that's the thread I think that ties these two things together.
Yeah.
Is I think the reticence for new residential development and the almost like vitriol against people who are trying to stop business development is kind of rooted in the same thing, that you're always like rooting for the individual somehow, you know, like and I think it's always framed as this like state versus the individual kind of dynamic,
especially in a city setting. I think that
Yeah.
makes it easier for city council members to vote the way they do.
Yeah, exactly. Where, you know, here it was, I think a lot of, even Bob Delp, right? Like, I think even he had this tone of, well, you know, it's the way the state law is written, so, you know, we should be deferential to that instead of just our exemptions that we sort of want out of, you know, wanting to make the process go faster. Whereas in the residential case, it was, you know, like, oh, these developers and the Housing Accountability Act are like stifling our ability to decide how we want our communities to be built. And so I just think that's like a fascinating axis that's, I don't know, just like a bit more nuanced than I had thought, but it gives me a better appreciation of what people want. And I mean, I guess I kind of agree with the spirit of it in a sense, but I guess what disappoints me about this and the previous appeal is that they are rarely grounded in any sort of like quantitative metrics or any sort of like, you know, good analogs. Like, ideally, you would want to find an example of a city that's as close as possible that made like, you know, kind of one decision in the fork versus, and then like a different place that made a different decision in the fork. And you would like to see like, okay, what were the general outcomes? Like maybe we can't say it's like causal, right? But we can at least say like, okay, maybe there's a correlation between, you know, avoiding these parking assessments and there being like parking issues, for example. Or, you know, maybe you could find the inverse of that. Like, maybe you would find out that, oh, okay, like you don't do these parking assessments and it turns out it doesn't actually change anything, because then people just come with like parking issues in general to like city council meeting, and so this kind of stuff gets resolved regardless. Or maybe the city is like proactive about it, you know what I mean? So yeah, that was kind of one of my takes, and I'm glad I am updating my beliefs based on actual hard evidence rather than just like, you know, kind of online pundits describing this stuff. Because it's like, as much as I like the YIMBY movement and things like that, it's like ultimately they're just sort of like online ideologues, and you, in my opinion, you should never ground a lot of things in just people who are online ideologues. Like, you should actually see the evidence for yourself and make a decision based on things that you actually observe or that you can quantify yourself. And we hope to bring that with this podcast to some limited extent. But yeah, I don't know. Do you have any kind of thoughts on
I
that?
think that's good. I think we really fleshed this one out. And then there was one final presentation at the end, right?
Yeah. So I'll kind of very, very briefly go over it. I didn't actually end up staying for the whole thing. So this is like I ended up leaving around like 11 p.m. because I, you know, had other stuff in the morning to do. And
Also,
I
you know, sleep is important.
Yeah, also I work on East Coast time, so you know, I just start around like 7 or 7:30, and I was like, okay, you know what, like, I'm not gonna get 8 hours of sleep. I should get as much as I can. But it was a lot about like the capital improvement projects, and I guess just a couple things I wanted to highlight is that the way a lot of capital improvement projects are justified, especially for transit or like transportation in general, are based on what's called like a level of service. And the way a level of service is measured is by the number of like seconds per vehicle, like the number of seconds a vehicle has to wait at like the average stoppage, right? So this could be like a stop sign, it could be like a traffic light, it could just be like a backed up on-ramp or something. And the city of Folsom aims to be level D or better, and D corresponds to 35 to 50 seconds per vehicle. So this would be like, you know, you're at a red light, you know, on average, you should be waiting around 35 to 50 seconds or less. And so, you know, obviously this can depend on the time of day and all these sorts of factors. And I just thought that was kind of interesting because I think it almost frames the reward in a very car-centric way, right? Because you could do these indirect things which make this metric better, but you don't really see an incentive to do it based on this metric. You might just have an incentive to be like, oh, well, we can fit in another lane, so let's just add another lane, and that'll improve the traffic situation. Yeah, and then I guess they mentioned that they were seeking funding, and I guess seeking funding corresponds to state grants and regional planning organizations. they mention a bunch of things where they get money from. So they mention transportation impact fees, which is Fund 446, drainage impact fees, because a lot of these capital improvement projects relate to like storm drainage as well.
Did they define impact fees?
The transportation impact fees, I don't know. Maybe I didn't say it long enough for them to define it deeply. There was also Measure A, which is Fund 276. I actually don't know what Measure A is.
It must have been something past.
Maybe it's, when it's like state bonds or something for this kind of stuff. The gas tax, which is actually, I want to say it was the plurality of the money, which is kind of interesting because they brought up the point of like, okay, as the transition to EVs happens, you know, the cars are still going to be on the road, but now the revenue is, you know, very much reduced. So how do you account for that? There was SB-1, which is like road maintenance and rehabilitation. So I guess it's like a fund of, hey, we want to make this existing road better rather than expand it. And then there's also interesting light rail impact fees. So basically anything that's like kind of within the vicinity of like a light rail stop or like a transit stop, or I guess in this case specifically the light rail. And the example they gave was at Folsom Boulevard and Iron Point. They made some improvements to the communication system to SAC-RT, you know, with like the gate that opens and like the light and things like that, and then they improved the crosswalk, and they were able to use some of these funds to fund that rather than use like the, you know, Folsom city taxes and other grants and things like that. Yeah, I'll kind of gloss over some of the other stuff. Yeah, I think the mayor also brought up a point of how a lot of the safety related funding is very reactive. So basically, if you have a number of severe accidents in an area, then you're sort of qualified to get some grant money to alleviate that issue. But obviously we want to prevent those accidents in the first place. So I think that was an excellent point that was brought up. There wasn't really like a solution that was proposed. It was just sort of like a glaring issue, I would say, that was pointed out. The other kind of the last thing I want to mention is that there is actually this kind of precarious relationship between applying for grants and the grant money that you're using. So a lot of grants have a stipulation that you have to provide some local matching. So for example, let's say you get a $100 million grant, they ask that you put in 10%. In some cases, it could be as high as 50%. And the idea being that, you know, you have some stake in this project, so therefore you have kind of an incentive to complete it and realize the benefits. However, in some cases, they will use money from other grants to act as the local match for subsequent grants. And they actually cited an example of like a situation where Caltrans, there was some issue with a grant they got from Caltrans and like another grant that they were applying to, and like the windows didn't quite correspond. And so like one wouldn't relinquish the money, and like the other one like was like, hey, you're not putting your local match. And you know, when you're talking on the order of like, you know, $10 to $100 million, this is like a whole year's worth of budget. So this is not like something that you can just be like, oh, whatever, like just take it from the surplus or something.
And it's not something a city would necessarily want to gamble with, because if there was an issue and then they were on the hook for one grant and the other one didn't come through, then they could really just throw everything off.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was kind of a fascinating detail, and that's around the time I left. So yeah, that was kind of it for the meeting. There probably is more stuff. I mean, if there really is like that much more stuff, I feel like this episode has gone on kind of long enough. But if there's something else that we notice in the meeting notes, we'll bring it up during the next podcast.
And on that, my closing thought being, I know the last couple of meetings have been very, very meaty in terms of the city council, and it's very encouraging to see people so engaged in the process. I think that's one of the things we really were hoping to see in this role. That being said, it really feels like these building projects are what seem to be the common thread motivating people to come out to city council. Whether or not that will continue in subsequent meetings, I'm not super confident that will be the case, but it has been exciting, one as hosts, but then two as a citizen to like see all this engagement. Yeah.
It's been super reassuring, and I definitely think the crowd skewed a bit younger during this meeting, which is like also a bit promising. It's kind of interesting, like the age of the crowd and like how that's correlated with like business development versus residential and things like that. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating. But yeah, I will see you guys next time.
All right, thanks.
Bye. How long do you think it was? Oh wow, just